Welcome to Kingdoms in Conflict. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Wallace. What shall we do with the Negro? It was a question asked in the late 19th century. Frederick Douglass would answer that question in an 1865 speech, quote, "What the black man wants," end quote. But is this a question we'd ask today? What would Douglass think of critical race theory, Black Lives Matter, and the 1619 Project? We'll discuss this and more with Reverend Dean Nelson, the Frederick Douglass Foundation chairman and founder, and the Douglass Leadership Institute when we return. Welcome to Kingdoms in Conflict. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Wallace, and we're privileged to have with us my good friend, Reverend Dean Nelson. How are you today, my friend?
Doing great, Dr. Wallace. Thanks so much for having me on your program.
Well, I want to ask you, this is a Christian show, and sometimes I ask people to give their testimony. For you, it may be, how you got involved in ministry.
Sure. Yeah, I got committed to the Lord as a teenager, and always knew that there was something that was, special about my encounter and my relationship with the Lord. And but I didn't think that I would be a preacher, at least not the type that I often saw in the pulpit in Sunday morning at First Baptist Church in Marshall. But by the time I was 18, 19, I was in college and felt a particular call into ministry. And think it was probably in 1990 when I gave my first trial sermon at Salem Baptist Church in Marshall, Virginia. And at that point went into full-time vocational ministry with an organization called New Generation Campus Ministries, which was led by Bishop Wellington Boone. And so I basically preached and taught on college campuses around the country.
Excellent. I didn't know you started so early. I started at age 17, so felt a call into ministry. So that's interesting to know. Now, you've been the chairman of the Frederick Douglass Foundation for a number of years. Tell our viewers the mission of the foundation and why you helped start it.
Sure. We like to say our tagline at the Frederick Douglass Foundation is righteousness, justice, liberty, and virtue. And we got started actually when President Barack Obama was elected to office. I was living in Washington, D.C. and knew a little bit about Senator Obama and knew that although he might have had a similar skin tone, he didn't really represent the values that I was raised with. And so that's kind of how we first began in 2009. And 2010, we had a leadership conference that had over 30 African-American conservatives that were running for office. And that kind of put us on the map. And so we started chapters around the country emphasizing conservative values, connecting African-Americans, particularly in a better way to match their votes with their values.
Do you view the Frederick Douglass Foundation as a part of your ministry now? And then how is that worldview reflected in the foundation?
Yeah, I've always felt that part of my calling was not just in the four walls of the church, but really to engage the culture. And the Frederick Douglass Foundation and its mission has allowed me to do that. When you think about Frederick Douglass, who was a great abolitionist, someone who was also a minister of the gospel, he was a guy that had an encounter with God when he was a teenager himself. And so out of his expression and devotion to God to help rescue and save his people from slavery, that's kind of the foundation. And if you do any reading of Frederick Douglass, whether it's some of his speeches or some of the things that he wrote, you would see that there is a strong emphasis on what we would call biblical justice. And so that is kind of the foundation for our organization. We like to say, again, righteousness and justice. When you look in the Bible, you'll often find those two words together. And Frederick Douglass was quoted as saying, "I have one great political idea. The best expression," he said, "I have found in the Bible. It is in substance, righteousness exalts a nation."
Amen. Amen. Now, did you say that Frederick Douglass Foundation is a 501c4, right?
Correct. When it was originally started, it was started as a political entity in North Carolina back in those days, and we have recently restructured it so that it is actually a recognized 501c4 entity.
Okay, so what kind of activities does your organization get involved in?
Yeah, so again, based on this idea of righteousness and justice, we have a variety of programs, from something that we call the Citizenship Academy, where individuals can kind of go through it, one, to help develop a more cohesive biblical worldview. Two, it teaches them a little bit about the political process. We have a session that we refer to as R's, D's, and U. So it's like, Republicans, Democrats, and you. What should I be a Republican? Should I be a Democrat? Should I be an independent? So we try to bring people through that type of training. Other activities that we've had in different states, we've had some strong pro-life initiatives. Right now, we actually are in a lawsuit with the city of Washington, D.C., because we were protesting during the pandemic, much like Black Lives Matter activists were. But some of our participants were sent to jail for writing on the sidewalk. So we have a number of pro-life initiatives that we've been involved with, as well as pro-family. And we train a lot of grassroots organizers to do door-to-door engagement. And so we've knocked on probably 1.5 million doors, distributing voter guides, helping people to understand where candidates stand on particular issues. So those are some of the things that we've done over the years as we have trained and equipped grassroots leaders to make a difference in their culture.
So how have you guys been received in the Black community? Because you're mixing politics and religion, and then you're trying to get people to vote their conservative values, for some reason seem to be difficult for some in our community to do. So how have you been received?
Yeah, I would say, man, we have been very, very well received. It's been encouraging. As you would know, our sister organization, the Douglass Leadership Institute, does have a strategic partnership with the Church of God in Christ, which is one of the larger African American denominations in our country. As long as we emphasize those values, and so we have initiatives that are strengthening the Black family. We have an initiative that's on criminal justice reform. We have an initiative that's on economic opportunity and school choice. When we push issues, people agree with us. And I think Pew Research showed that 71% of Black Americans consider themselves to be conservative or moderate. The challenge, as you would well know, is when you try to get people to transfer those values in the voting booth by voting sometimes for Republicans. And that is a more difficult task. But I'm really happy that we were, through our efforts, have seen in different states larger numbers of African Americans that are matching their votes with their values.
So you've mentioned in your talk earlier the Frederick Douglass Leadership Institute. You want to tell us a little bit more about that and your Jeremiah 1:5 project? And I think you mentioned the Black Family Report.
Yeah. So as you mentioned earlier, the Frederick Douglass Foundation is organized now as a C4 and has more activist and political leanings. The Douglass Leadership Institute is a C3 that is not partisan. It is focused simply on pushing good public policy. And so we have done that in a variety of ways, one of which you just mentioned, the Jeremiah 1:5. You're familiar with that scripture from Jeremiah that talks about, God shaping you, in the womb, being a prophet, from the foundation of the world. And so we've used that initiative to engage over 500, mostly African-American pastors, to stand up for the sanctity of human life. Almost a third of abortions that take place in our country are performed on African-American women, and they make up about 12 to 13% of the population. Part of that initiative is really helping people to better understand the eugenic aspect behind abortion in America. A lot of people don't know the history of Planned Parenthood, where its founder in 1939 wrote a letter to the Clarence Gamble of Procter & Gamble Fortune, who stated that we don't want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. She would use ministers in her diabolical plan to help engage to shrink the population of Black people because she felt that we were weeds, degenerates. And so as a result, this initiative is to help educate those in the Black community about the history of eugenics in America, and particularly as it is unfolded now in abortion, where 80% roughly of Planned Parenthood's surgical abortion facilities are found in Black neighborhoods. So we're kind of sounding the alarm through that Jeremiah 1 and 5 project.
Right, right. Now the Black family report.
So, one of the things that we decided to do at the Douglass Leadership Institute was to pull some research and to kind of retell the narrative of the resiliency of the Black family. If you go back from the beginning of the colonial period, even free Blacks in the North were penalized in taxation at a different rate than their white counterparts. We can talk about the slavery and what slavery did, and how even though it was forbidden for slaves to marry in most states, you still had Blacks in record numbers, sometimes conservative estimates, hundreds of thousands of Blacks, though went against the grain and against the law and the pressure to actually get married. And then if you go all the way through, the 50s and the 60s, where we've had, horrible public policy that sought to break up the Black family. So this report highlights that, and it talks about some of the challenging statistics, like you've been familiar with the 72% of children that are born in the Black community are born outside of wedlock. So we highlight that, but I'd like to emphasize, though, there are some positive aspects that needed to be highlighted. And I think that this report feels that if we can find some of the positive things and shed light onto the positive things, we're hoping that would actually give a pathway forward for Black America to see how the family can be restored.
I think one of the interesting things is as we look at history and the Black family, obviously there were a lot of things that were working against Black families back then. Like you said, in some states, Black slaves couldn't get married, but when they did, if you read some of the stories of folks, they'll talk about how the family may have been separated, but they'll walk miles and miles to be reunited with their loved ones. And I would think, and I'm interested in how you see this, that there was more damage done to the Black family in the 60s with government programs than there was even during slave time.
Yeah, there's a scholar from Johns Hopkins University, I think Churland is his last name, who emphasized that if you were born in slavery, you are more likely to be born in an intact family under slavery than today. And so those are some harsh realities. Although this report does show that in some measures, Black children actually are, well, I should say Black fathers are more apt in some cases than white fathers to be more engaged with their children. It kind of dispels the narrative that most Black fathers are not engaged. The majority of Black fathers are actually engaged with their children and live with their children, even if they're not married to the child's biological mother. So there are some things that we try to highlight to show that through the fatherhood initiatives and other things like that, that we are seeing, I think, a little bit of a turn where Black Americans are becoming more committed to finding ways to restore the family.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that, and I'm interested in looking at this report. Is it so? The report is out.
Yes, the report is out. We have only released it at the Black family forums that we've done. We've done one in DC, one in Atlanta, and this weekend will be in Charlotte, North Carolina. But after that, it will be online and available at the dlinstitute.org. And if anybody wants to get a copy of that report today, they can go to dlinstitute.org. If you don't see it listed, you can simply join our email distribution list, and we'll send a copy of this new report to you.
Excellent, excellent. I'm glad there's this kind of work being done. I know we also have part of Freedom's Journal Institute. We started Black Families Matter, and so I'm glad there's a number of different organizations now looking at the Black family and what we can do, especially with Black Black Lives Matter, kind of having a different voice talk about the family, because we've always said, if you really believe the Black Lives Matter, we should be concerned about the Black family. So kudos to what you're doing. I appreciate that. I do want to ask you, you've kind of said this already, but why Frederick Douglass? What's special about Frederick Douglass that you would name both your organizations after Frederick Douglass?
There are a couple of reasons for that. Number one, when I was a child, probably just in grammar school, my mother brought home a series of Black history comic books that Martin Luther King Jr., Harriet Tubman, Robert Smalls, and there was one figure in all of those comic books that had two books, not just one, because he lived a long life, and that was Frederick Douglass. So I was introduced to Frederick Douglass early on. He's always been a hero of mine. When I got a little older, I read a quote where Frederick Douglass said, "I'm a Black, dyed-in-the-wool Republican and would never be a part of any other party but the party of liberty and progress." And so at that point, my political ideology was changing a little bit. I was becoming a little more conservative. And when I saw that Frederick Douglass was a Republican, I didn't know that Blacks had a history of being Republicans early on. And so that was a second reason. I think the third reason was when I learned that Frederick Douglass was a minister of the gospel. Early on, he had an encounter with God, a powerful encounter with God, that left him pursuing God with all of his heart. He then became a teacher of the Bible and became a licensed minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And so I think for all of those reasons, Frederick Douglass became a hero to me. And we saw that he was someone that had been kind of left out in like the modern, days. And so we tried to elevate him as a radical, as someone who was passionate about a cause, and someone who possessed the biblical values that I think America and Black Americans in particular should not jettison in this generation.
Yeah, I became fascinated with him, and especially, you listen to him, the question was, what should we do with the Black man? And he comes back and says, do nothing. You're doing with us, you're meddling in our lives has caused more problems than is necessary. I'm wondering what you think he would think of Black America today, and with Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, and the 1619 Project. How do you think he would look at what's happening today and the culture wars?
It's a great question, and I've thought about it a lot. And I think that if you study Douglass, particularly in the latter third of his life, Douglass was critical of Black people, and in some cases fell out of favor with Blacks from time to time, because he did challenge Black people to own their own things, to really commit themselves to work, to study. One of Douglass's most famous messages that he preached all around the country, and really even around the world, was self-made man. There was this sense from Douglass that we had the power ourselves if white people got out of our way. And so this idea of self-determination was very unique, with Douglass compared to what we hear about today. I don't think that he would have much excuse or toleration for an idea that seeks to place blame on someone else. Douglass also was a person who blessed and forgave the man that had enslaved him. And so I think that is wholly lacking from our discourse today. It's about placing blame often on someone else, whether it is required or whether it should be placed there or not. Douglass would have none of that. I mean, he spent a lot of his time challenging white clergy and white Christians during his day because of slaveholding. But I think that is a far cry from what we see within our culture today. And so I think that Douglass would have a strong challenge to Black America to own up to the sacrifices that he and others during his generation made to see Black people advance.
I think he'd also have something to say about the 1619 Project in there, looking at the Constitution as racist, because I know at one point he thought that the Constitution actually promoted slavery, And then when he actually sat down and read it for himself, he had a change in attitude about the Constitution. And
That's exactly right. He called it the glorious liberty document where you can't find slavery in it at all. So you're absolutely right. He did. And I think that's something that people miss about Douglass was that there was an evolution in the man of Douglass, and America did change during his lifetime. I mean, when he was born, he was a slave. And when he died, he was a fairly well-to-do black man who was actually married to a white woman. So it's a very different contrast.
I want to take a step back to a bigger picture now with a little bit of time we have left. Do you think that the church is the only hope for America?
I think the hope for America and any people is Jesus Christ. And I think that the church is his messenger and his ambassador in this hour. And so I think that the church, as Dr. King said, has to be reminded that it is not the master nor the servant of the state, but it's called to be the conscience of the state. And if the church doesn't recapture its prophetic zeal, it becomes an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. So I have hope. Jesus still has hope and believes in the institution of the church. We just need to see some bold leaders coming out of it to help save her from herself, I believe.
Well, I appreciate that. That's a great place to actually end. Man, I appreciate everything that you're doing with Frederick Douglass Foundation, with the Douglass Leadership Institute. I look forward to us, doing some more things. We didn't really talk about that, the Black Summits we've done together. So I look forward to seeing you in person again and actually doing some more work together. Continue what you're doing, brother. You're doing a great work. And those who are watching, we'll be back in just a moment. Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Wallace, President and co-founder of Freedom's Journal Institute for the study of faith and public policy. And I'm here today to tell you about a project that we're really excited about. It's called Racism in America and the Role of the Church.
We live in a time and day of conspiracy, a threat to the poor, a threat to the have-nots.
We're doing this series because we believe that the Black church needs to hear another voice. There's a voice out there that is secular. Society as well as the media are pushing the narrative that there's a resurgence in racism in America, especially with the rise of groups like Black Lives Matter and other protest groups. It's tearing the church apart. And I believe it's time for the church in general, and the African American church in particular, to have another voice that has a different point of view, a biblical worldview. I'd ask you to prayerfully consider making a donation to this project. Thank you. Welcome back. Quote, everybody has asked the question, and they learned to ask it earlier, the abolitionists, what shall we do with the Negro? I have had but one answer for the beginning. Do nothing with us. Your doing with us has already played a mischief with us. Do nothing with us. If the apples will not remain on the tree of their own strength, if they are worm-eaten at the core, if they are early ripe and disposed to fall, let them fall. I'm not for tying or fastening them to the tree in any way, except by nature's plan. And if they will not stay there, let them fall. And if the Negro cannot stand on his own legs, let him fall. All I ask is give him a chance to stand on his own legs. Let him alone. If you see him on his way to school, let him alone. Don't disturb him. If you see him going to the dinner table at the hotel, let him alone. If you see him going to the ballot box, let him alone. Don't disturb him. If you see him walking into a workshop, just let him alone. Your interference is doing him a positive injury, end quote. This excerpt was taken from the Frederick Douglass speech, What the Black Man Wants. Douglass would continue to say, let him fall if he cannot stand alone. If the Negro cannot live by the line of eternal justice, so beautifully pictured to you in the illustration used by Mr. Phillips, the fault will not be yours. It will be his who made the Negro and established that line for his government. Let him live or die by that. If you will only untie his hands and give him a chance, I think he will live. He will work as readily for himself as the white man, end quote. Douglass was promoting self-help amongst black people and less interference from society as a whole. The argument at the beginning of his speech was for black men to have the right to vote. He argued for them to have a say in the direction of the country, the state, or the town where they resided. Self-determination was the key to blacks moving forward. Like any white man, blacks would rise or fall based on the sweat of their hard work, ingenuity, and business savvy. Douglass's only ask, besides the vote, was to leave black people alone. The idea was that no one should ever do for someone what they can do for themselves. It will make them dependent on you. He just asked, quote, "If you will only untie his hands and give him a chance, I think he will live," end quote. The speech of Douglass is a far cry from what we hear today. Critical race theory blames white people for everything wrong with the black community and invites white participation that Douglass rejected. According to critical race theory, systemic racism prevents blacks from advancing, and because of this, working to advance oneself through hard work, education, and moral character makes no difference. According to critical race theory, there is no merit system. Racial realism, according to critical race theory, means that privileges and status are given because of race, thus the term white privilege. See, race determines who gets into the best schools, the best jobs, and invites the parties, not your hard work. If this is true, then Douglass is wrong. But it's not true because Douglass himself was proof that a black man could rise from poverty to affluence. He was a runaway slave who died a wealthy man. One need only look at our history to see that the first blacks to enter predominantly white professional sports, to see that the NBA and NFL are predominantly black. I mentioned the building and the rebuilding of Black Wall Street, despite the race riot, in a different episode of Kingdoms in Conflict. Black people have made an impact on the United States of America from its beginning. Douglass notes this in his speech. Part of his argument for voting is that blacks have been counted on as citizens to defend this country. Quote, "When this nation was in trouble in its early struggles, it looked upon the Negro as a citizen. In 1776, he was a citizen. At the time of the formation of the Constitution, the Negro had the right to vote in 11 states out of the old 13. In your trouble, you have made us citizens. In 1812, General Jackson addressed us as citizens. He said, fellow citizens. He wanted us to fight. We were citizens then, and now when you come to frame a conscript bill, the Negro is a citizen again. He has been a citizen just 3 times in the history of this government, and it has always been in the time of trouble. In the time of trouble, we are citizens," end quote. Yes, racism and slavery have been a blight on the history of America. However, if black people are allowed to take advantage of the American dream for themselves, they can build a good life, regardless of color. That is what Douglass is arguing, and it flies in the face of the barrage of cultural Marxist rhetoric that is espoused today. We are kingdoms in conflict.